This evening, if you want to go ahead and open your Bible to follow along with me, we're going to be camping out in Genesis chapter 16. But I wanted to start and tell you one of my recent experiences. On November 4th, at about 11:45 p.m., Megan and I had quite an experience. We were called to a labor and delivery room to be the first people to hold a sweet little baby girl. And we spent about the next 24 hours as that little baby girl's parents. And I have to say that it was a beautiful experience that I wouldn't trade, even as short-lived as it was. But because around 6 p.m. on November 5th, that all changed very suddenly, really. That sweet little baby girl was taken back out of our room and for us never to see again. What ensued after that was really probably one of the greatest gut punches that I have ever personally experienced. And during that time, I found myself just wondering, what in the world is going on? There were so many things that happened leading up to that point that seemed, if you will, like opening doors. What was going on that all of a sudden it changed? And there was nothing that I could do, nothing I did wrong. It was just painful. So after that event, I have to say that I've been quite drawn to the story of Hagar. And I hope that you will understand by the time that I get finished this evening why that I was drawn to that story. So if you will, let's look at Genesis chapter 16. We're just going to work our way through it. It's not that long of a chapter. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. So in this just first verse in the chapter, we get introduced to a woman called Hagar. As far as I know, it's the first time that her name has been given and the first time that we hear anything about Hagar. So I want to take some time to try to answer just a few easy questions about her. Who is she? Where did she come from? But mostly, what can we learn from her? Obviously, we know that she is an Egyptian. We're given that. We know that she is Sarai's maidservant. We're given that. But that's really about all we know at this point. So where did she come from? Obviously, the answer to that is Egypt, right? Where else does an Egyptian come from? But where did she come from, really? When did she get to be a part of the group that goes around with Abram? Because something that I often forget is that there was a big group of people that went around with Abram and Sarai. I so often forget that because we just focus in on Abram and Sarai, maybe even sometimes Lot. But there's a bunch of people that go around with him, thinking about just this one fact. Abram and Lot, they had so many people with them that their herdsmen were fighting over, the land wouldn't support them. They were fighting, and he says, no, let's not have this. Let's choose to split up. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left, whatever. And so Lot, that's when he goes and he pitches his tent near Sodom and Gomorrah. Ended up being a very bad choice for him. And Abram, he said, look to the north, south, east, and west. All the land that you see, I will give this to you. He's got so many people. Now, that's Genesis chapter 13. But in chapter 14, Lot gets captured. There's a war between 5 and 4 kings, and they capture Lot and his family and a lot of people, and they take them away. And Abram gets 318 trained men that it says were born in his own house. And he goes and pursues, and he gets them, brings them back. Just think about that. 318 men just in his own house, trained, ready to go for military. That's a lot of people. So all these people coming around with Abram, where did they come from? So whenever you really think about it for just a minute, that's quite an entourage of people that are with Abram everywhere he went. Again, we often forget that just because we zero in on Abram and Sarai. So when is it that Hagar, one of these people that went around with him, when did she get to be a part of this group? I think that the answer to that question can be found actually in Genesis chapter 12. It doesn't say this outright, and this is maybe a little bit of conjecture, but I think it's very reasonable to go this way. Looking in chapter 12, starting in verse 10, it says, "Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, 'I know that you are beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, "This is his wife." Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake.' When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Egypt saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, and female servants, female donkeys, and camels." He gave him what? All these livestock and male servants and female servants. The king of Egypt gave them those. And that's very interesting to me because I think about the fact that Hagar is an Egyptian maidservant. Where would you get an Egyptian but in Egypt? So I suspect that this is where Hagar became part of this entourage. She became a maidservant to Sarai when they were in Egypt, and Pharaoh was giving Abram all these things, all this great wealth, and it's kind of interesting to think about. Do you suspect that Hagar really had any choice in the matter? I don't think so. I bet it was just something that she had to endure. So that's where I think Hagar came from. Again, it doesn't say that explicitly, but I think it's a reasonable assumption to make. So now she's part of this big entourage of people. So she ends up getting into what you might call a bit of a predicament. So how did that happen? I think it answers the question really straight off the bat. Abram's wife Sarai had no children. And interesting thing, Sarai, the name, I have read that Sarai can mean a mockery. And that being childless, Sarai very much could have felt like she was a mockery among other women. So she develops a solution to her problem. Starting in 16 verse 2. Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from having children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to her husband as a wife. Now to my Western ears, this sounds like quite an awful idea. I can't see that this is going to go well at all. But I did a little bit of research on this because it's such an unusual sounding practice to me. Is this a common thing? And apparently, yes, actually. It was a fairly common practice for women to offer a servant to their husband as a means of having children. What I think is interesting is that many times you discover that this fills the void, the pain of empty arms, but does not heal the wounds of an empty womb. There's still very much a real pain that can continue even after you're raising a child, because there's two different things. But take notice here. This is 10 years in Canaan. And so that means it has been 10 years since God promised Abram numerous descendants. Now, from my own personal experience, I can tell you that 7 years is quite a long time to wait to have children, and I can imagine that 10 years is harder. Obviously, it's longer. Much less the 25 years that it actually takes for the son of promise, Isaac, to be born. So Hagar, she now finds herself as a wife to her mistress's husband. Once again, do you think she had very much choice in this situation? I don't think she did. I think it was just, this is what you're going to do, and she had to do it. So we continue. Verse 4. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. As a result of this harsh treatment, Hagar ran away. She didn't choose the situation she was in. So she didn't exactly get herself into this mess. Nevertheless, she was in it. And it was hard enough that she decided it was better to run away. So let's see what happens. Verse 7. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. So she was running away. She was fleeing. And as best as I can tell, she was headed toward home. You can see on this map the way to Shur is pretty well on the way to Egypt. If you just keep traveling west, you'll find yourself in Egypt. And it is here that the angel of the Lord found Hagar. And as she interacts with this angel of the Lord, it seems clear both by how the angel speaks and how Hagar responds that this angel is what we would call a theophany, that is basically God taking on flesh. And the Lord then calls her by her name. At this point in the chapter, in the dialogue, there is no other mention of her name. The people call her, your servant is in your hands, or my servant. It never says her name. Take my servant as a wife. But the angel of the Lord comes along, calls her by her name. And when he asks where she is coming from and where she is going, she only answers part of that question. I'm running away. Basically all she has to say. And I take from that she didn't really have a plan on where she was going to go, only that she simply could not stand to stay any longer. But what does the angel of the Lord promise? He does not promise to fix the situation. He doesn't really change her circumstance at all. He says, go back and submit to your mistress. He doesn't change the situation. He doesn't say, Sarai, be nice. None of those things. But he does speak of her son. He will become a multitude too great to be numbered. And I think it's interesting because so many times God doesn't fix our problems, even though I certainly wish that he would. Instead, he shows up in the midst of our problems. But the angel of the Lord is not done speaking. The angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her El Roi, for she said, truly, Here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. She calls his name El Roi. What does that mean? This is the name that Hagar essentially gives to God. I can't help but wonder if up to this point she had experienced God at all. Obviously, I would expect that she had heard of him. After all, she is living with and traveling with Abram, a man who had been called by God and driven around the places that he went by God and built altars to the Lord. But I doubt that she had personally experienced God. And now she has. In a time of trial, the Lord showed up in a time of great affliction. The angel of the Lord said, "Name your son Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction." And I understand that Ishmael means God hears or God pays attention. And that alone seemed to be enough for Hagar. He had seen her and had paid attention to her situation. And based on that experience, she calls God El Roi, the God who sees. She even names the well after that, Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. Thinking about that, I'm very much reminded of Exodus chapter 2, whenever there was the Pharaoh that arose who knew nothing about Joseph, and he had started to oppress the people of Israel to the point that they were crying out to God because of their affliction and the abuse of slavery that the Pharaoh had put upon them. They cried out to him, and at the closing of that chapter, Exodus 2, verse 25 says, God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. And this really has been, I think, a very comforting story to me. God did not fix all of her problems. He did not make Sarai be nice to her. He did not take anything away from her. Instead, he simply came and acknowledged her problem. He validated it, and he saw her. He is El Roi, the God who sees. He sees his people, and he sees me and you, even today. Now let me get back to the story that I began with this evening. After our adoption did not finalize, we received a whole host of cards from people in response to that situation, and I very much appreciated that. Many people wrote and simply said, "So sorry this happened. We're praying for you." Let me say that people who acknowledged our situation offered so much comfort to us. We simply wanted to be, and maybe needed to be, seen and acknowledged. That is why I wanted to talk about Hagar. Not necessarily because of the woman herself, but because of how God revealed himself to her as a God who sees his people in their afflictions. He acknowledges the difficulty of life, and he speaks tenderly to us. That is why I believe that the gospel is so beautiful. Because God sent his one and only Son to be Emmanuel, God with us. He knows what it is to be human and to endure pain and suffering. He very much knows what we are up against. He sees us. He has called us by name. We are his.